I was about to learn how associating with the opposite sex could do worse than provoke the withdrawal of my parents' love. It also harbored the potential to enrage them. My father had just arrived home from work when my mother informed him about the phone call. His posture hardened, his expression transformed. He flung first his laptop onto the sofa, then its charger. Then he threatened, "I'll slap you so hard, I'll make your head spin round." In the days that followed, while he monitored my confiscated phone to see if I'd get any more calls, I had my first experience of literally shaking with visceral fear. Whatever I was guilty of, it was costing me too much. To soothe my screaming conscience and atone for my wrongdoings, I decided to adopt the headscarf. My father had instructed me to wear it to secondary school, but up until then I'd only been feigning wearing it, leaving the house with it on, before sneakily taking it off before I got to the bus stop. I would be a good Muslim girl, I reprimanded myself. I would repress my sinful feelings. I would get my parents to love me again. And for a while, I managed it. In fact, I managed it so well that one of my mother's friends commented, "She's so good despite being raised in England." "We are strict with our children. We keep them under control," my mother responded dryly. Hi, I'm going to share the incredible story of Zara Zareen and the write-up she made on Medium where she tells her story. She was told she had to marry her cousin. She was a Pakistani-born woman living in UK, and she was told that she has to marry her cousin. Now, because of this actually ended up being the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. It was just one thing among so many other things that once she was forced into this decision, it was just going to continue being a string of bad choices, one after another. So, what ended up happening? How did she get the courage to tell her family, "No, I'm not going to marry my cousin"? Well, it wasn't easy. She had to end up running away from home. She snuck out. She ended up seeing a documentary on ex-Muslims, and now she's a free woman. Let's hear and see what she went through and how she ended up leaving Islam and also not marrying her cousin. My personal struggle against an insular tradition. Before I declined the arranged marriage proposal from my first cousin, I almost accepted it. This story is about the almost acceptance. It's about the social pressures which nearly buckled me into a yes before I resisted and reclaimed my right to say no. It's about the cultural codes of honor, perceptions of duty, and the deeply entrenched values of allegiance to kin which underlie the custom of cousin marriage in Pakistan, my country of birth. Growing up in a conservative Pakistani family in Bristol, United Kingdom, I often struggled with the image of the subservient daughter that my parents projected onto me. Finally, I reached a crisis point at the age of 22 and chose my freedom over my family's expectations. The strength to say no. Almost 18 months have passed since I said no to marrying my cousin. In that time, I found the strength to say no to many other things, and my life has changed in ways I never imagined possible. I've left my parental home behind to live independently, taboo for an unmarried woman of my cultural background. I've rejected the constraints of a dogmatic religion in which I was involuntarily indoctrinated. I found a partner of my own choosing, and we've established a romantic relationship outside of marriage. The journey hasn't been easy. It's a culture which assumes that women's sexuality is associated with men's honor, that men therefore have an inherent right to control women and discipline their life, and that a woman's existence is a commodity owned by her father before her marriage and her husband after her marriage. Sure enough, last month, when I called my parents and told them that I'm in a relationship, this expression of sexual agency was too much for my father to bear. In response, he branded me a shameless woman with no modesty or morals, claimed that my ongoing disobedience must be symptomatic of a psychological breakdown and dismiss my desire for autonomy as the equivalent of smearing shit on his face. You don't care how badly you disgrace us in front of the community? You don't care if people spit on our faces in disgust? Would any decent woman ever do the things you've done? Over the speakerphone, I heard my mother breaking into sobs. Nobody has ever hurt us as much as you've hurt us. It makes no difference to you whether we live or die. What kind of daughter are you to us anyway? Were my father's last words before the line went dead. I foresaw that vitriolic response. However, that doesn't mean I'm not grieving. I've cried in my partner's arms, unable to articulate what I'm aching for. I've had dreams in which my father is hugging me again. I wasn't expecting my family to approve, but I felt I had to try at least once to give them the chance to accept my decisions. They're my parents after all. They raised me, clothed me, fed me, and in their way, they loved me. Perhaps somewhere deep down, I allowed myself the childish hope that their reaction would pleasantly surprise me. Instead, it was an explicit culmination of the implicit messages I'd grown up receiving all my life. So one thing I really like about this article is she tries to explain the other perspective. Why is it that they think the way they do? She's not just putting it down and saying it, she's actually analyzing it critically and saying, well, why do they think this way? Putting yourself in someone else's shoes is one of the best things to do because it helps you, it's empathy. It helps you to understand their perspective. And when you understand someone else's perspective, you can actually connect with them much better. The concept of honor. Honor pertains to a learnt, complex set of rules an individual follows in order to protect the family reputation and keep his/her position in the community. Males can lose honor and be shamed by failure to control women in their network. The punishment of bringing dishonor on one's family can be emotional abuse, physical abuse, family disownment, and in some cases even murder. In the book Daughters of Shame, Sangeeta clarifies, trying to explain the concept of honor is one of the hardest things. Asian people are swaddled in it from the moment they are born. It's as though they absorb it along with their mother's milk. Honor is the cornerstone of the Asian community, and since the beginning of time, it's been the job of girls and women to keep it polished. And that's really hard because many things can tarnish it, including any sign that a girl is getting westernized. That's what Asian families fight so hard against. The list of social taboos is long. Having a boyfriend, being seen talking to boys, having male friends, using social networks such as Facebook, Instagram, or Snapchat, wearing Western clothes, wanting to integrate. All of these actions and many more can be interpreted as dishonoring one's family. But how did cousin marriage come to be seen as an expression of upholding honor by my family? What motivates cousin marriage? Her study conducted among Pakistanis in Bristol found that they were often wary of matches even with other British Pakistanis for fear that they will have been contaminated by what they view as the amoral climate of the West. In contrast, there is a perceived security and trust inherent in close kin marriage, since the suitor, being a relative, is previously known to the family, and any undesirable traits such as lack of religiosity are therefore more difficult to conceal. So she's saying that, when you're marrying inside the family, it's much easier to control for factors that are outside of your control. Like you don't know, for example, if the man is, even if he's a Pakistani, but he's not a cousin, you don't even, it'd be harder to know whether he's religious or not religious or whatnot, right? In addition, familial duty drives parents to offer their own children to their siblings' children as marriage partners. So they're saying it's considered like a duty that to get your siblings' children married to your children. When my parents tried to push me to consent to my cousin's proposal, they wholeheartedly believed they were acting in my best interest and theirs. They were keeping me on the straight and narrow and honorable traditional path. I would go from belonging to my father to belonging to another man he had appointed. a trusted family member in this case. There would be no dating, no westernized nonsense. By keeping things in the family, they hoped to protect me from outside unscrupulous influence and ensure that I ended up with a man they deemed respectable. Illicit sexual behavior and parental shame. After my refusal to submit to this tradition, a chasm opened between me and my parents, and it has continued to widen ever since. My wish to determine the nature of my own relationship makes no sense to them. In their eyes, individualism is selfishness. Moreover, premarital relations are immoral. Cohabiting out of wedlock is degeneracy, and my objections to cousin marriage are evidence of being brainwashed by the West. Still, had I declined to marry my cousin, but consented to remain the single, virginal, sole property of my father, my parents, although ashamed of my assertiveness and unwillingness to acquiesce to their demands, might have been able to tolerate me. However, upholding family honor also involves strict regulation of women's sexual behavior. A sense of collective honor among kin is reflected most drastically in the preventing or punishing any illicit sexual behavior by the kinship group's women. In that context, the fact that I've chosen a partner of my own and on top of that refused to be rushed into marrying him as a result of religious pressure to appear virtuous is interpreted by my parents as dishonoring and disrespecting them to the extreme. It took many years for me to recognize the closed-minded and controlling nature of environment I grew up in. For the longest time, I just accepted it. As a child, I even thought the problem was me. In some ways, I'm glad my parents tried to pressure me into something as restrictive and illiberal as marrying my own cousin. It was because of this that things finally reached breaking point, and I woke up and decided that they needed to change. Childhood memories, silence, slaps, and the threats of strangling. My mother and father were brought up in Hyderabad, Sindh, in the southern region of Pakistan. They shared the same ethnicity, religion, and language, but not the same ancestry. However, much like cousin marriages, their marriage was entirely arranged by their own parents on the basis that their families knew each other. On the other hand, I grew up in Bristol, England. I was a year old when my parents migrated from Pakistan to Britain, and 22 when my father informed me of a proposal on behalf of a cousin living in Abu Dhabi, UAE. I was stunned, but perhaps not for the reason you'd think. It was the first time in my life I've heard my father hint at a context in which he sanctioned my association with a man. Romantic feelings, intermingling with the opposite sex, such things had always been taboo in our household. Growing up, I was prohibited from playing with my neighbors because they were boys. I resigned myself to watching them and my brother through the window instead. If there was a program on TV in which two people happened to kiss, my father would change the channel until the scene was over. At age 9, I wrote a childish note about a crush I had in primary school, not meant for anyone's eyes but my own. Strike one. When my dad found it, he warned me, "You know this is wrong," and gave me the silent treatment for several excruciating days until I promised never to do it again. But what was it? It remained unspecified. Write about my crush? Have a crush in the first place? Feel anything at all for a boy? I was so desperately relieved when my dad started speaking to me again, so grateful that the sudden and complete withdrawal of his affection was over, that he didn't care to clarify exactly what had upset him. I concluded simply that my emotions were wrong. Attraction was shameful and had to be suppressed. So I got better at pretending. Meanwhile, my parents got better at enforcing. In secondary school, they pulled me out of sex education. My mother told the teacher who phoned to question the decision that I lacked the emotional maturity to cope with such material. At age 13, I slipped up again and received a phone call from a boy. Strike two. I was about to learn how associating with the opposite sex could do worse than provoke the withdrawal of my parents' love. It also harbored the potential to enrage them. My father had just arrived home from work when my mother informed him about the phone call. His posture hardened, his expression transformed. He flung first his laptop onto the sofa, then its charger. Then he threatened, "I'll slap you so hard, I'll make your head spin round." In the days that followed, while he monitored my confiscated phone to see if I'd get any more calls, I had my first experience of literally shaking with visceral fear. Whatever I was guilty of, it was costing me too much. To soothe my screaming conscience and atone for my wrongdoings, I decided to adopt the headscarf. My father had instructed me to wear it to secondary school, but up until then I'd only been feigning wearing it, leaving the house with it on, before sneakily taking it off before I got to the bus stop. I would be a good Muslim girl, I reprimanded myself. I would repress my sinful feelings. I would get my parents to love me again. And for a while, I managed it. In fact, I managed it so well that one of my mother's friends commented, "She's so good despite being raised in England." "We are strict with our children. We keep them under control," my mother responded dryly. Then one summer at 16, I fell short of the mark once more. Naively, I got involved in a teenage relationship, and my mother witnessed the youth in question kissing me on the cheek. Strike 3. Behind closed doors, she slapped me multiple times, commanding me to bow before God for forgiveness. I prostrated in tears, believing I deserved every slap. She warned me, "Your father would strangle you to death if he knew what you've done." Imagine all this just over a little peck on the cheek. Why the proposal shocked me. Enough of this over the years, and you learn to erase every trace of sexuality in front of your family. You learn that daddy does not like it when you like boys. So when, in the summer of 2017, my father suddenly began talking about marrying a man, it took me utterly by surprise. Initially, my dad was pleased to see me respond to the proposal so hesitantly. He interpreted it as virginal shyness. In actuality, my pause has much less to do with being coy than with the shock at the subject he was suddenly raising. And in an episode of Christiane Amanpour's documentary series, Sex and Love Around the World, a young woman from India perfectly articulated the dichotomy underpinning the culture of arranged marriage. When you're a child, you're not allowed to talk to a boy until your parents deem you fit to get married. So you're told, "Don't talk to boys, don't talk to boys, don't talk to boys. Now fuck this one and have babies." What an amazing quote. To make matters even more perplexing, this boy in question, of course, was my cousin. And there's no specific Quranic passage that endorses consanguinity. However, I think that gender segregation encouraged by religion may bear at least some relation to the high incidence of cousin marriage in the above locales with predominantly Muslim populations. This is an amazing point. This is an amazing point because it shows that sometimes the connection between Islam and what happens in Muslim societies is not a direct Islam says you have to marry your cousin, therefore there's high cousin marriages, but it's an indirect relationship due to other things in Islam. For example, the fact that there's very high gender segregation. The Prophet Muhammad warned against an unrelated man and woman being alone together, lest they invite the company of Satan. In the absence of an extended courting period in which a prospective couple can freely determine the compatibility before marrying, intermarriage between trusted close relatives can be seen as a way of mitigating the risk involved in selecting suitable spouses, right? So basically, like, without dating, like, how are you going to know who you're going to get married to? My own father stated his aversion to the idea of giving me to a stranger or allowing me to date, but in attempting to marry me to my cousin, he believed he was picking the safe option. He even suggested that if I experienced marital problems, then as my husband's uncle, he would have the authority to intervene and reprimand him. Right. Okay. So just to summarize, basically they think that by marrying your cousin, you're actually helping your daughter and your son to be, keep it within the family and also protect them because you know that this person is good because you actually know them really well. But Dr. Rafat Hussein's 1999 study of the social cultural determinants of intermarriage suggested that marital conflicts can lead to souring of existing family relationships. So quite the opposite from what people are thinking. It can actually cause much worse family conflicts if your daughter-in-law is your cousin and your son and they're having a conflict. Well, you can actually spoil the extended relationship then. So instead of just like helping the problem, it can make it worse. A sense of claustrophobia. In my own case, however, I was not convinced. In fact, I was overwhelmed by claustrophobia. 7.5 billion people in the world, and the one I was supposed to marry was my cousin? The world seemed suffocatingly small. My own conscious memories of my cousin consisted of brief meetings on family holidays. For the most part, we'd grown up continents apart. Besides, my home life had taught me that being members of the same family on paper could not guarantee mutual understanding. By the time the proposal came, I was already a closeted atheist, torn between my parents' religious and cultural expectations and my desperate desire to make my own life choices. My parents subscribed to the belief that unmarried women do not move out of their parental homes to live independently. Otherwise, they bring dishonor and misery on the families. Maybe in the right circumstances, marriage might have even seemed to me like a welcome escape ticket out of their home. But here it seemed obvious that wedding my cousin would only barricade me right back into another restrictive prison. I wanted freedom, and I wasn't going to get it by marrying into my own conservative family. When I recovered from my initial shock, I said, at least at first, no, 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 no. Besides, there was another problem, and my father was already aware of it. Certain members of my dad's extended family suffer from congenital mutism. They also happen to be the offspring of intermarriages. Genetic implications of cousin marriage. So, the chances are 2.5 times more that you're going to have, genetic abnormalities when you marry your cousins. They're saying that even when you control for several factors, it still remains a significant factor in early mortality, basically early death. Multiple deaths have been reported in a proportion of cousin marriages from developing countries and in migrant communities resident in developed countries, the effect being proportional to the level of parental genetic relatedness. As if this wasn't enough, both mild and severe mental retardation likewise tends to be increased in frequency. In the UK Pakistani population, elevated rates of cerebral palsy have been reported in cousin marriages. My parents may not have read Bittle's paper on consanguinity and its relevance to clinical genetics, but it's inaccurate to say that they were wholly unaware of these issues. My dad has a PhD in computer science. My mother qualified as a medical doctor in Pakistan. They are by no means uneducated people. If it had just been the genetic implications of intermarriage that were bothering me, I could have made sure my cousin and I got genetic screening before we were married. But what truly disturbed me ran much deeper than that. It was a stiflingly limiting idea that I had to pursue my future partner within strict ethnic, racial, religious, and in this case, familial limits. These limitations were not simply coincidental, arising out of accessibility, convenience, or preference, but they were rules being enforced with sectarian bigotry. I'd often heard my father criticizing Sindhi men who chose to marry Urdu-speaking Muhajir women outside of their ethnicity, accusing them of squandering their cultural heritage for lust. Even if you put genetic implications of first cousin, or even more broadly, endogamous unions aside, there was something socially problematic about the tribalistic mentality my father was promoting. So she's saying that it wasn't just, cousins, it was like you had to marry within the same exact community. Keeping it in the family, cousin marriage as control. Unfortunately, the fact that cousin marriage is such an inward-looking marriage choice is precisely the reason it appealed to my parents, right? In his book, If You Had Controlling Parents, family therapist Dan Newhart explains how parental rigidity and over-control are commonly motivated by fear of external threat. Ultimately, my parents urged me to enter into cousin marriage for the very same reasons they dictated how I dressed well into adulthood. When I cut my hair without his permission, my dad raged. Too much bodily autonomy was dangerous. You want to be a boy now? What's next? Wearing shorts because boys do? He demanded when I went against his command. I'm the man of this house and I get to say what happens to my family, even to the hair on your head. A similar terror motivated my mother when she insisted that I take off my underwear and show her my used sanitary towel to prove that I wasn't faking my period to enjoy exemption from prayers. In Islam, you're allowed to skip the prayers if you're menstruating. The same defensive instinct provoked my dad's fury when I started questioning religion. If we'd known that education would taint you like this, we'd never have allowed you to go to university. In families of mine, restrictions placed on a daughter's behavior in the name of honor and religious observance all too often stems from parents' deep-rooted mistrust of their environment. It's not uncommon for South Asian families to conceive of the Western social order as unstable. So there's a lot of mistrust of the Western cultures, and they see it in the worst possible way. So from such a standpoint, if a daughter begins to show signs of westernization, arranging her marriage can be a method of reducing her exposure to a dangerously licentious environment, thereby preventing unwanted behaviors. As a teenager, I remember being confronted by my mother when she suspected me talking to boys. Do you have some kind of sexual problem? Should I tell your father to stop your education and get you married to resolve it? The implication was that talking to boys was by nature a sexual act, regardless of the actual content of the conversation, and that my mother would rather sequester me in marriage than run the risk of me fornicating. In my case, my parents wanting me to marry my cousin was the ultimate preventative measure against wandering ideas. The permanence of marriage would seal the direction of my life. Moreover, marrying me to a trusted relative who was known to be religious would offer the greatest security, since in Pakistani culture, the social risks of marriage are perceived to be greater in marriages arranged outside the family than within. Arranging my marriage within the family was my parents' way of safeguarding my mind and body to the greatest possible degree. They found nothing questionable about this. They were fulfilling their responsibility. They were protecting me from the outside world. In their eyes, any potential genetic issues associated with marrying my parental uncle's son were far less significant than the perils of irreligious Western influence, which they were desperately trying to mitigate. You gotta wonder, why do they even live in the West, you know? Like with all of this like fear and mistrust and like hatred of the culture and emotional blackmail, my experience. Think about it, my father said, the first time I refused. Think about it. I tried my mother instead. I don't want to marry. I don't want to marry anyone, let alone my cousin. What happened next startled me. Without warning, she began to cry. You'll be a burden on your father. Do you realize what you're doing? Your uncle will feel insulted that you refused his son, and he'll stop speaking to your father because of you. Those first few sentences left me speechless. I was aware that family heads can feel insulted if marriage proposals made on behalf of their children are refused, but my mother's unwillingness to defend my choice tore into me like a betrayal. Suddenly, my self-esteem plummeted. I felt like a sacrificial goat. Your father will be lonely in his old age, she continued. He's already alone in this country, isolated from his siblings. Do you want to cause him more misery? Do you? At this point, I admit I faltered. When you're taught from birth that the honor and happiness of your family must always override any individual selfish need or desire, I don't think it's possible to overstate the psychological pressure that breeds. It's not surprising that women develop a sense of helplessness or are resigned to accepting what they perceive is the hand of fate. The fact that women do not assert their rights has more to do with lifelong conditioning about upholding the natal family's honor. And indeed, in my case, an overwhelming sense of guilt and obligation ripped through my guts as my parents continued their pressurizing. It was the way my father started one sentence with, "I'm not like those illiterate village men. I'm not going to force you," and ended another with, "I never thought I'd have to beg my child to do something." It was the fluctuation in his tone sometimes. "Don't you think I love you? Don't you think I know what's best for you?" And later, "Why don't you say it? Just say yes." He had brought me up. He sacrificed for me. And in return, he implied I was emasculating him. "Do whatever you want then. Fine. Let people say I have no control over my own daughter." And so I confess I wavered. I considered giving in again, the way I had worn hijab to please my father in childhood, or bowed before God to please my mother as a teenager. I felt indebted to something beyond myself. Emotional blackmailers' comments and behavior keep us feeling off-balanced, ashamed, and guilt-ridden. We lose confidence in our own effectiveness. Our sense of self-worth erodes. But perhaps worst of all, every time we capitulate to emotional blackmail, we lose contact with our integrity, the inner compass that helps us determine what our values and behavior should be. Was I really a burden on my parents? Was I being selfish by refusing to marry my cousin? They raised me in childhood, so did I owe them my adulthood? I was losing contact with my own integrity, all right. I felt like I was being eaten alive. The courage to refuse. So how did I finally fight my way out of it? Personally, I believe my ability to say no was greatly strengthened by the journey away from religion I was taking at the time. By backing me into the cousin marriage corner, my parents forced me into crisis mode. I saw the trajectory my life would take if I continued submitting to principles I didn't believe in. I realized how urgently I needed to resist. It was time not only to come out of the atheist closet, but to shake my fist in the face of every other enforced tradition that had for so long demanded my unquestioning obedience. All my life, I had followed my parents' rules. From a young age, I've been brought up to believe that the purpose of my life was to please God, and part of pleasing God was pleasing my parents. If, in my ingratitude, I denied the existence of God or arrogantly flouted his edicts, I'd be condemned to burn eternally in hell after death. Most children don't consider this a desirable fate. Neither do they desire the withdrawal of love from their parents. So throughout my childhood and much of my teens, I earnestly attempted prayer. I rose at dawn to join in with the rituals of fasting. I suppressed my questions, at least in front of my parents. I did the best to suppress my sexuality. I covered my hair at my father's command. Well into adulthood, my mother monitored the messages on my phone to ensure that I was not being poisoned by the outside secular world, and I did not leave the house to socialize without permission. So time and time again I hear about examples of people, examples of young men and young women who really tried to be religious, who really tried to believe in God, who really tried to make it work, who really tried to make it happy, but they just couldn't. Because it didn't make sense, because it didn't click, because it wasn't true. But they tried. We really did try, right? And so when you hear about ex-Muslims and you hear Muslims say, "Oh, you're not a true ex-Muslim, you were never really a Muslim," realize that this is not true. Most of us, we sincerely attempted to be that person, to be that believer, but it just didn't work. Then, around my 22nd birthday, despite feelings of immense discomfort, I sneaked into a documentary screening about ex-Muslims. I had been drawn to it for reasons I couldn't quite explain, but afterwards I wept because there was a part of me I finally recognized itself. About a month after the screening, a copy of Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion found its way onto my bookshelf with the spine turned towards the wall so my parents wouldn't see the title. It was a book I had been enticed by and simultaneously afraid of for a very long time. I knew that if I agreed with any of its contents, my world would be shattered forever. It was not the last of its kind that I would be reading. I knew that if I agreed with any of its contents, my world would be shattered forever. Meanwhile, I was working as an English teacher in a secondary school. Day after day, I stood in front of teenagers at the beginning of their journeys of self-discovery, encouraging them to try new things, to step outside of their comfort zones, and to think critically when engaging with the world around them. Every time I did so, there was a part of me that felt like a fraud and a hypocrite. Even as I said those words, For the sake of my family's happiness, I was still pretending to follow a religion which was becoming more and more certain I had ceased to believe in. What kind of role model, what kind of advocate of free thinking was I? It was around this period in my life that the proposal from my cousin came. Internally, I had already said no to God, the greatest authoritarian of all. In some ways, saying no to my parents was more difficult because of my ongoing emotional attachment to them, but breaking the shackles of doctrine made it much easier to stand up for myself than it might otherwise have been. Instinctual self-preservation finally surpassed the guilt. With the prospect of cousin marriage looming on the horizon, my family life had become so confining. I understood that my only option was to fight my way out of it. I knew I could no longer yield to my parents' insular way of life. In the end, I decided that although I did not blame my parents for their worldviews, I could no longer share them or accept their limitations. I began to make plans to run away. The importance of a support network. This part of my life proved to be the most important transitional period I have experienced so far. During this time, I was extremely fortunate to have access to counseling through my employer. In fact, having a range of people with whom I could talk with and explore my options made an immeasurable difference to my mental health. I wept in the office of more than one counselor. I had a friend who encouraged me to question my thought process when I was stuck in illogical cycles of guilt and half contemplating giving in to my parents' demands. This friend, herself a Muslim to whom I believe I owe my life in some ways, yelled at me with absolute conviction over the phone, "Don't do it, Zara. Don't say yes." I called Karma Nirvana's helpline for victims of honor-based abuse, and that played a fundamental role in helping me realize that although I had normalized the expectations my family were forcing on me, in reality these expectations were unhealthy and unfair. I had non-judgmental support and acceptance from a lecturer, from an ex-teacher, from a Muslim chaplain, and from work colleagues who encouraged me to find the inner strength and emotional resilience to make the decision that was best for me. I know I was extremely lucky to have access to as many good listeners as I did. I wrote a letter to my parents explaining my decision to leave my home and my religion behind. And one morning, in the early hours while they were sleeping, I escaped to begin my new life. Voicing my truth. Dan Newhart has suggested that growing up controlled means having your speech, feelings, and thoughts stifled. Speaking up about a past or ongoing control helps some people balance out a childhood of speech control. The purpose is to voice your truth. I wanted to share my story because I would like to be able to offer hope to others who are faced with similar difficult situations and choices and need safe, accepting spaces in which to explore their own paths towards happiness. Having left the oppressive elements of my religion and culture behind, I now derive meaning from other sources in life. And I know I will derive a great deal of meaning from providing comfort and support to others who are in the same situation that I was once in. There was a time when I believed that I had no power to change my future and no strength to resist the direction that my family envisioned for me. So if you have anything at all to say about this topic, I would love to hear from you. So there you have it. Do check out her Medium at zara.zareen. The link is in the description below. And what a motivating story. You know, what a motivating story to other ex-Muslims who would need to come out, who are in difficult situations. What a motivating, empowering story of a woman, a young woman who was able to change her life for the better and, you know, overcome all of the programming that she had received, all of the cultural programming, all of the religious programming. And so if you are in a similar situation, you know, take comfort in the story, you know, get help from people that can help you, get friends, even, you know, sometimes Muslim friends can be good friends and can help you, those who are willing to, you know, those who want the best for you, you know. And so you do check out the article, follow her on Medium, you know, thank you for writing such a wonderful article, Zara. Those of you who are new to this channel, please do subscribe and keep up with my content. And if you can afford to support me, do check out my Patreon page and my support page at abdullahsamir.com/support. Making these videos takes a lot of work and a lot of time. And I would love to do this full time. I would love to continue sharing these stories, making videos on the topics of secularism, Islam, freedom from religion, apostasy, atheism, and all of those things. Thanks for watching. This is Abdullah Samir signing out.